Welcome to GDs. And this is The Old Man, Season 1. Season starts with Dan Chase, living alone in a secluded house, having visions of his departed wife, who died after battling Huntington's disease. With no human companions, his only support are his dogs, Dave and Carol. In addition, he also communicates with his daughter Emily, quite regularly. Dan, coming back from a routine checkup, gets a bit paranoid, seeing an unknown face in the town. Returning home, he ties a few cans, and hangs them on his door. Later, hearing some noise, he wakes up, and his dogs run downstairs. Dan moves slowly with his gun, ready to confront the intruder, but before he could, his dogs take down the intruder. Dan questions the man, but the man was not willing to answer, resulting in Dan shooting and killing him. He then arranges the body and the gun to make it look like a fair fight for the police. After skillfully avoiding the police's questions, he takes his go bag and gets on the road. Dan calls Emily and informs her about the events. He lets her know that he will have to hide and regroup, and it might be a while before he could contact her again. We then get to see Harold Harper, the assistant director of the FBI, as he plays with his grandson, who recently lost his parents. Harold, in pain because of his loss, breaks down in the bathroom. It is when his wife brings him the phone, and Harold learns from Agent Raymond Waters that they need his help for bringing in an agent who went missing in 1987, and he is reaching out since he has a history with him. Harold, learning the same, leaves immediately to assist the agent. On the other hand, we see Dan sitting at a diner, planning his getaway, and telling someone over the phone to prepare the house, and we learn that he has created another alias under the name of Dixon. Dan, noticing a woman sitting alone at a corner table, is reminded of his younger days, and in a flashback, we see a younger Dan discussing with Abby the idea of creating new identities and settling down as a married couple. Abby, though afraid, knowing that people will never stop looking for them, agrees to his plan, and they decide to settle down. In the present, Dan gets a call on his phone, and it was from Harold. He tells him that he knows about his location, as they have been tracking his truck. He informs him that he has 3 minutes before they reach him. Learning this, Dan starts to move. Listening to Dan and Harold's conversation, we learn that both Dan and Harold were in the CIA and carried out covert operations, with Harold being Dan's handler in the agency. Though not being in touch, Dan kept tabs on Harold's life and offered his condolences for his son and his daughter-in-law's unfortunate death. Harold informs Dan that he has been ordered to help the agency as they come for him, and he believes it is because of Faraz Hamzad, as he wants to settle an old grudge. Harold advises Dan that the agents after him are heavily armed and dangerous, and his only option is to disappear completely, which will entail in him cutting off contact with his daughter forever. He further explains to him that he is only helping him out in order to protect both of them, as he doesn't want what they did to come out. Harold then tells him that if he doesn't disappear, he will have to come after him, and he will be forced to use his daughter as leverage against him. Knowing the same, Dan gets quite furious and angry, but knowing it to be the logical choice, he calls his daughter to say goodbye, as he will have to cut all ties with her, since it is the only way for him to keep her safe. Emily, having some idea of his father's past life, was not willing to accept this, and she tells her father that he cannot run away. Emily wants him to take a stand, and reminds him who he really was, and tells him that she wants him in her life. Dan, after talking with his daughter, decides not to run, and he tricks the agents following him, and with some help from his dogs, he takes them out, and is able to get away. Dan ditches the car, and gets behind new wheels, under a new identity, and reaches a house he booked. Being at the house, the landlord Zoe knocks at his door, and he was surprised to see her, as he believed the property to be standalone. Zoe tells him that she lives next door, and put up the place for rent after her husband moved out. Zoe, seeing Dan's dogs, tells him that he needs to leave, as she had no pets policy, and Dan agrees to do so. As Dan prepared to leave, his car broke down, so while waiting for the tow truck, he cooks a meal for Zoe, hoping to make a good impression. Zoe, listening to his story, and having a good time eating a meal with him, tells him that she can make an exception for him, and can allow him to stay, provided he pays 2 months' rent in advance, and cooks for her 2 days a week. Dan agrees to her demands, and returns back to his place, and finally lies down, giving his bruised and broken body time to heal. Meanwhile, Harold, along with Agent Raymond, inspects the aftermath that Dan left. Agent Raymonds suspected Harold to have some kind of involvement in assisting Dan, but had nothing to go on. In addition, he was also confused as to why Dan decided to stay, when he could have simply vanished. Harold leaves the site and goes to see Morgan Boat. Morgan, having been a mentor to both Harold and Dan, tells Harold that Faraz Hamzad, gaining power in the region, has been able to pressure the State Department to hand them over Dan, and for the time being, he will get whatever he wants. He then gives Harold a phone number and tells him that his legacy will be at risk if Dan is caught. Then in a flashback, we see a young Harold meeting with Dan in the desert of Afghanistan. Harold tells him that he couldn't secure the weapons he asked for, as the US government doesn't believe that the person whom he is supporting is the right one to back. But Dan assures Harold that he has seen his guy's potential, and he knows that with their help, he will come out on top. In addition, he also believes his man is the right person to come on top. Harold, trusting him, agrees to arrange for the weapons, but tells him that he will be doing so without approval, and if it ever got out, their own government will come after them. In the present, we see Harold returning to his office. His protege Angela asks him why he's back at work so soon, as he just lost his son and daughter-in-law. Harold tells her not to worry, and wants her to work with another agent, and tasks them to find Dan Chase's daughter. Agent Waters also comes to their office, and convinced that Harold helped Dan, he tries to turn Angela against him. He tells her that Faraz Hamzad is a powerful Afghan warlord, and Dan is believed to be his feared assassin. He further informs her that when Dan was active in Afghanistan, the station chief of the CIA then was Harold, and there is something he is hiding from them now. Angela lets Waters know that Harold is like a father to her, and nothing he says can make her betray him. On the other hand, Zoe asks Dan out to dinner, and Dan agrees to the same. Though he thought of ditching the plan, but listening to her daughter's advice, he decided to go out for dinner. At the dinner, Dan talks about his wife's dementia and her eventual death from Huntington's disease, while Zoe shares details about her recent divorce, and they seem to have formed a bond. On their way back, they are stopped at a police checkpost. When Dan is questioned about his identity, Zoe steps in and tells them that he is her husband. Knowing the same, they allow them to leave, but told Dan to drive, as Zoe seemed to be under the influence. Returning back, Zoe takes a reluctant Dan home with her, and they spend the night together. As Dan wakes up, he hears a bottle break. As he reaches the kitchen, he sees Zoe upset, and learns that her son missed his exam due to unpaid tuition. Dan offers to help, but Zoe refuses. Dan, hearing her out, quietly starts to clean up the glass, while Zoe comes over and rests her head on his shoulder. At the FBI office, Angela was not able to locate Dan's daughter. Knowing the same, a reluctant Harold, thinking that he has no other way, calls on the number he got from Morgan, and arranges for Dan to be executed. He gives him Zoe's home address, which he got after going through police barricade photos, where he was able to identify Dan. The next morning, Dan planned to leave and head towards the city. Zoe, knowing she covered for him, asks him why the police were looking for him. Dan tells her that he was involved in an unsanctioned war, and now, his actions have come back to haunt him. He tries to convince Zoe to join him. It is when he receives a call from Emily, and she talks with Zoe, and urges her to trust Dan. In addition, she tells her that she should decide whether to join her father or not, but should do so quickly, as the authorities know about his whereabouts, and will be reaching soon. It is now that it's revealed that his daughter Emily and Harold's protege Angela are the same person. Zoe, not wanting to join him, tells him to leave before she returns. As Zoe gets out of the house, we see Dan being attacked by the assassin Julian. Zoe, being outside, sees Dan's dogs agitated, and she frees them. The dogs attack Julian, providing Dan an opportunity to shoot at Julian, forcing him to flee. With Julian gone, and Dan knowing that Zoe is no longer safe in her house, he grabs her and takes her with him unwillingly. Before leaving, he takes out his rifle and shoots down the drone that the FBI deployed. We then get to see in a flashback that the person whom Dan was supporting in the war was indeed Faraz Hamzad. Hamzad, considering Dan to be one of his closest ally, tells him that apart from winning the war, he also needs to win over his wife Balor. We later get to see Balor as she reaches there, and when she reveals her face, we learn that she is Abby, Dan's future wife. As Dan interacts with her, she tells him that he doesn't bring anything extra to the table, except being a weapons broker. But Dan assures her that he is much more than that. In addition, he tells her that he is also a pretty good sniper. In the present, with Harold losing Dan for the second time, Agent Waters was quite furious, and he blamed Harold for aiding Dan. He tells him that the US government, in order to make Hamzad happy, are willing to give him anything, and he now believes that Harold orchestrated his escape both the time, and he is going to report the same. Listening to him, Harold comes clean to him, and tells him that he thinks that Hamzad wants Dan alive, as he needs some kind of information from him, and he knows it all started when Dan took away Hamzad's wife. As Harold ranted about Hamzad's wife, Angela, not being able to listen, stops him, and shifts the conversation. She tells Waters to contact Hamzad directly, and asks him what he wants to know, and perhaps they might find answers for him. On the other hand, Dan tells Zoe that he took her, as it was no longer safe for her. In addition, she can no longer contact her son, as it might put him in danger also. In a flashback, we are then taken back to Afghanistan, when Hamzad learns about an attack by the Soviets, although they attacked his rivals, but Hamzad wanted to avenge his fellow brothers. Dan helped Hamzad's men to go after the Soviets, and they captured their commander Suleiman Pavlovich. With him being captured, and Hamzad killing the Soviets brutally, his wife Buller started seeing him turning into a monster. Hamzad, wanting to know who has been providing information to the Soviets, torturers Pavlovich, but he was holding on. Later that night, Buller meets with Dan, and asks for his help in aiding Pavlovich's escape. She tells him that she is the one who has been giving the information to them, as it was weakening their rivals, as when the Russians will finally leave, her husband will then be the one strong enough to take the power. But if Pavlovich revealed her name in the interrogation, she, along with her husband, will be hanged. Dan, learning the same, tells her that her husband is an understanding man, and she can tell him the truth. It is when he learns from Buller that apart from this, she is the only person alive who knows about an area that is rich in minerals and can be a game changer because of its wealth, and the Russians are searching for the same. But she cannot give this information to her husband, as this will make him gain too much power too quickly, and it will corrupt him. Dan, understanding her concerns, helps her out, and aids Pavlovich in his escape. In the present, Dan's cover of Dixon is a wealthy businessman. He checks into his penthouse, and Zoe takes the identity of his wife, Marcia Dixon. As Zoe waits in his luxurious penthouse, Dan goes to meet Zachary, the person who is responsible for managing his company's funds. Dan wants a significant amount of his money to be transferred to Pavlovich's mining company, hoping it will secure him a meeting with Pavlovich. On the other hand, we see Angela spending time at Harold's house, and we learn that she was close to her son and daughter-in-law, and is also fond of her grandson. In addition, she looks towards Harold as a father figure. Later, Angela, Harold, and Waters get to meet with Hamzad's lawyer, and she reveals to him that not getting what he wanted, Hamzad will be releasing a statement, putting the entire blame on Harold. Harold, knowing that there is more to it, tells Hamzad's lawyer that he can provide Hamzad with what he wants, which is information. As he was there when it all started. He tells her about Hamzad's wife, who escaped with Dan. Hamzad's lawyer, not knowing the same, tells them to wait, as she connects with him. As they waited, Waters learns from Angela that she always felt that she never knew her mother, as some part of her was missing, thus she wanted to become good at whatever she did. So when in the academy, an instructor dismissed her because of her looks, despite her being good, she punched him. She was then fired for her actions, but her boss's boss Harold threatened to walk out with her, and this is what prevented her from being let go. So, he can try as hard as he wants, but she will never betray Harold. Harold, on the other hand, learns from the assassin he sent that Dan was prepared to leave, as if he knew they will be coming. Knowing this, he knows that there is a mole in his organization, and he starts to suspect Angela, as every time he mentioned Belor, he got a strange reaction from her. As Hamzad's lawyer returns, she tells them that Hamzad will consider the conversation ongoing, but only if they will get on a plane, without knowing its destination. Having no other option, Harold agrees to do the same. Emily tells Dan about what transpired, but despite him telling her not to go, Emily joins Harold on the plane. Being on the plane, Angela attempts to make conversation, and it leads to Harold confronting her about her true identity. Angela tells him the truth, and Harold felt betrayed, as he considered her to be a part of his family. In addition, it is also damaging for him to have had a mole within the FBI for 10 years, especially someone so close to him. Harold tells her that her deception is like treason, especially since she's a sleeper agent for her father. Angela, gives it back to him, by letting him know that he too hired a professional assassin to kill her father, and it is also considered to be treason. After lashing out, Emily tries to persuade Harold to work together in order to resolve the situation. Harold, knowing it to be the best option, reluctantly agrees. She also tells him that her father's colleague, Morgan Boat, played a vital role, and it was because of his assistance she was able to get into the FBI. Meanwhile, as Dan returns, Zoe sits down to have dinner with him, and she reveals to him that she has sent a letter to the board of directors, announcing her decision to divorce him. She expects this will cause chaos over his asset division, and disrupt his plan. Zoe offers Dan two choices: give up half of his company, or to pay her a substantial exit amount. Dan lashed out at her, but Zoe remained determined, resulting in Dan quickly resolving the issue by agreeing to Zoe's demand, and he signs over half his company to her. Zoe is surprised, but Dan explains that the money was never the main concern, it was just a tool to protect his family. And with his daughter's life at risk, he needs to close a deal and head to Morocco to meet with Pavlovich. Knowing his daughter to be in danger, Zoe decides to help him, and she was able to get Zachary to transfer funds to Pavlovich's mining company. But before leaving the country, Dan leaves his dogs in a pet center and makes Zoe their guardian. We then get to see another flashback, where we see Hamzat confronting his wife and his loyal friend Dan about them helping the prisoner escape. Balor tries to tell him not to seek answers, but he insisted, and Balor tells him the entire truth. Knowing the same, he wanted to know about the location of the mineral deposit, but Balor, not wanting to see him become a tyrant, refused to give up the information. Hamzat threatens her and tells her to take a few days to reconsider, while he tells Dan to leave immediately. Dan, seeing Hamzat unfold, gets in touch with Harold and updates him on the situation. He then asks him to arrange for his and Balor's extraction. Harold agrees to help him, but tells him that before leaving, he will have to take care of Hamzat, or it might come back to haunt them. In the present, Harold and Emily land in Tunis. The location is significant, as it was the last place where Dan and Balor stopped before heading to the United States. Harold and Emily are taken to an old office filled with government papers and flight manifests. Harold thinks that this might be Hamzat's way of testing his knowledge about the events. He accepts the challenge and finds the flight details of Dan and Balor. Despite handing over the information to Hamzat's lawyer, she tells him that the details of his treachery will be leaked by the end of the day. Emily, seeing a stunned Harold, tells him that he has been framed, and they must now work together with her father. Meanwhile, we see Morgan calling Agent Waters and telling him that his favoritism towards Harold and Dan has resulted in many problems. And he has now decided to form a special task force to take control of the situation, and would like him to be a part of it. And Waters agrees to do so. We then see Morgan meeting with Julian, signifying him to be the other member of the team. Later, Harold gets in touch with his wife, and she tells him about the rumors, accusing him of helping a fugitive spy and hiring an assassin. She lets him know that she is scared and thinks that they might need a lawyer. She then hands over the phone to Morgan Boat, who is at their home. Morgan tells him that his only way out is to blame Angela for everything and leave her to disappear, and he should just head back home. He also tells him that Emily was planted with her on Dan's request. As Emily approaches Harold, he hangs up the phone. Heading toward Morocco on a train, Harold asks Emily about the bank account she just used. Emily explains that it was her father's idea of a covert way of communication in an emergency. She also tells him that since 2012, they've only communicated through burner phones. And she even skipped her mother's funeral for secrecy. When Harold suggests that this secrecy must have hurt their family, Emily defends their sacrifices, saying she and her father would do anything for each other, and sometimes that's enough. In Morocco, Dan and Zoe arrive at a luxurious hotel. Zoe, impressed by his skills as a spy, tries to learn, and Dan shows her his last way of communicating with his daughter, which is through a shared bank account, where they send coded messages, and he just received a message from her daughter, telling him that she is coming to see him. Zoe and Dan then take a speedboat to Pavlovich's island. At Pavlovich's party, Dan is able to meet him in his office. Pavlovich tells him that he expected his favor to be called in. Dan asks him to help him track Hamzat, as he holds a grudge from their past. Pavlovich smiles, reflecting on how Balor influenced both Hamzat and Dan. He reveals to him that Balor was not sent by the Russians, indeed, she was the one who recruited him. Learning this, Dan is quite surprised, and thinks that Balur might have used him as well. Pavlovich then informs him that Hamzat expected him to reach out, so he was pressured to hand him over. As his guards try to detain Dan, he disarms one and shoots another. Chaos erupts at the party, while Dan grabs Zoe and heads to the docks, and they manage to get away. While Harold and Emily, reaching the station, spot an agent at the exit. Emily tells him that she is the one who have called them, as she received a message from his grandson about an old man at the house, which scared him. Harold tells her that the man was not from the bureau, but was Morgan Boat, and he wants him to return back, leaving her behind. But despite her being the cause of all his problems, he was not willing to do so. Emily tells him that he needs to do this, as innocent people are in danger, and she needs to fix things. Being able to convince Harold to leave, they hug and part ways. As Harold was about to exit, he sees Agent Waters in a van and realizes that a team might be after Emily, but before he could get to her, she was gone. With Emily being taken, Harold goes to see Dan, who was surrounded at the pier. He tells him about Emily being taken, and was able to confirm that it is Morgan's men who have her, and he plans to use Emily to clean up the situation. And he has a plane ready for either Emily or for him. Dan, in order to save his daughter, agrees to surrender. He also tells Zoe that now she can also return home. Harold, taking Dan to the airport, wants to know what Hamzat is after. In addition, he also asks him what he should tell Emily about her mother, as she seemed obsessed about finding out more about her. Dan, seeing how much Harold cares for his daughter, admits that he thinks Balur might have manipulated him. But he insisted that Harold should tell Emily that her mother loved her and did everything to protect her. Their talk is interrupted by Waters, who tells him about a potential attack at their hideout. Dan asks Harold if Hamzat knows about Emily, and Harold thinks it's possible. Knowing the same, he realizes that Hamzat is making his move to grab Emily. With Emily being in imminent danger, Harold and Dan decide to head towards her, and are able to lose their escort. Meanwhile at the safe house, Water and others, knowing they will not be able to stop an attack, decided to leave. They were able to push through the first ambush point, but were surprised by the second. As Harold and Dan reach there, they find Waters and Mike shot dead, while Emily was missing. This is when we learn that Balur and Dan escaped with Hamzat's daughter years ago, and Dan didn't want to kill Hamzat in front of her daughter. And they kept it from Harold for his safety. And that's what Hamzat was testing him for, wanting to know if he knew about his daughter. And as the season ends, we see Hamzat reflecting on a letter to his daughter as he prepares to meet Emily, while Harold and Dan head to an airfield, determined to confront Hamzat and to rescue Emily. Thanks for watching. And if you liked it, please subscribe.